climate change high-level champion for Egypt. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be with you today in the second part of distinguished lecture series, The Road to COP27, representing a solid partnership between the Center for Economic and Financial Research and Studies, CEFRS, Cairo University, Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, ECES, Economic Research Forum, ERF, Institute of National Planning, INP, and the World Bank Group to organize these events. Today's topic, financing the green transition in developing countries, is of particular interest, especially when we think of the need of large investment financing, the type of finance, the range of activities needed, the role of public sector, and how to mobilize private finance by looking at the experience of India, Indonesia, South Africa, Egypt, as well as other developing countries. All these issues will be discussed during the next 90 minutes by our distinguished panelists and our keynote speaker, Dr. Montek Ahluwalia. To organize this session, I will invite first His Excellency, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, and then it will be for the opening remarks. And then, And then we shall move to Dr. Montek Ahluwalia for his talk, and then Dr. Khalid Fahmy, former Minister of Environment, will give us some comments. Then Her Excellency Dr. Hala Said, Minister of Planning and Economic Development, will join us for the closing part. Then a session of question and answer will take place. And now, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's a great pleasure to join this event today. And I'll be very brief because like you all, I'm looking forward to a very substantive discussion with Dr. Montek Ahluwalia. I'd like just to refer to a couple of things, and perhaps with the permission of our excellent moderator, Dr. Adla, I may come back with some issues on the substance of the discussion, especially on the finance side. So just as a reminder of why we have these seminars and events, it's basically coming as a simple answer to a very complicated question. What's in it for us in this country to host a big event like the COP? Summits and big conferences come and go. It's basically about the impact, especially in the host country and the host community, that we need to benefit more from. Days away from Sharm el-Sheikh, I can assure you that the arrangements and the preparations on substance and format are excellent. What you, especially if you are a frequent visitor and attendees of any of these conferences and summits of COPs, you will be getting the same kind of expectations met, but definitely more, because we are in very different times than we were back in Paris or in Glasgow. But at the same time, the big issue about what's in it for us and what will remain as transformation of our thinking and our ways of designing policies, and how our institutions are interacting with the new realities in a fast changing world. And for that, I think, in addition to what you expect from the host of COP27 to tackle the different aspects of the Paris Agreement on mitigation, on adaptation, in a good day, I hope we can see some progress in loss and damage. and definitely on finance, which I think will take some good part of our discussion today. But in addition to those four very well identified tracks, I think for a country like Egypt, middle income country with regional strong attachments to Africa, to the Mediterranean, to the Arab world, the Middle East, and with very strong ties with countries around the world, you would expect more from the host this time than a typical event for a few days or a couple of weeks. So I would say three things in addition to the four tracks on the Paris Agreement that everybody knows. But when I say everybody, it's an exaggeration. Perhaps everybody in this room, but in a survey by Gallup, when they conducted a couple of weeks ago, the extent of public awareness of the importance of climate change as an existential risk, only 51% had said that they feel really and believe that climate change is that important and require immediate action. 49% either put it in a list or of priorities or they didn't. And I think one of the main things in this country here, and this could be one of the main objectives of this discussion today, is to raise awareness to not just to those who are in this room or those who are connected, but beyond this room, especially with the presence of the media with us and the participation. And there is a great deal of simplification that could be required, and perhaps making an effort to link matters of concern of the day-to-day kind of challenges facing our people to what the climate action agenda could contribute to. Will the climate action agenda be helpful in access to energy, not in this country because we have surplus in electricity, but in our continent, have 600 million out of 800 million around the world are without electricity. Will this conference will help us to deal with the increases in food prices? And we had more than a fair share of concerns and impact on the recent developments on food prices. Will this conference do much more? I would say it would do more in three areas. One, in the collaboration that was just mentioned by Dr. Adler, that the think tanks, including the Institute of Planning here, the Center for Economic and Financial Research and Studies, the Economic Research Forum, and the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, the four bodies, all of them had been working hard together with the leadership, with the researchers, with their communication team to organize the series of events in partnership with the World Bank Group. And I'm very grateful to my good friends and colleagues from the World Bank to facilitate this series of lectures. That shouldn't really stop by the time we are in Sharm el-Sheikh, because many people, again, part of the awareness, may not know that our presidency of the COP starts and doesn't end with Sharm el-Sheikh. And until this moment, I'm still receiving invitations from my good friends from Glasgow to attend meetings and events and activities. I'm expecting the same as well from the presidency of the COP, not just in the invitations and activities and events, but on following up on the substance of the outcome of the Sharm el-Sheikh agenda. So this is the first part, is basically the kind of collaboration that we'll be seeing between research centers. Yesterday, I started the day by a visit to the University of Sadat City, then another visit to Alexandria, University of Alexandria. The city University of Sadat is around 40,000 students. Alexandria is around 200,000 students there. Not all of them were in the events, but I was briefed that they were involved in some climate action activities, and their curriculum is going to be changed, and the research agenda is going to be changed. And very soon, the Minister of Higher Education is going to be announcing a new fund to support joint research, not just joint between Egyptian researchers, but with researchers from this country and beyond. There are other activities as well related to research and education that we'll have the time to discuss in the future. Another two important initiatives, but I will mention them after the talk of Dr. Montek Ahluwalia, because I think they will be of relevance to a couple of issues, being familiar with many of what he's been publishing. And day before yesterday, and actually yesterday, on my way from Alexandria to Cairo, I listened to two of his recent discussions on climate and climate finance. One of them was in London and the other one was in India. So I may anticipate what he might be saying, and I'm preparing possibly a couple of issues of interest to him and to you based on our work. And these are basically more things to resonate with us beyond the COP, in addition to the Paris Agreement. Having said that, I'm very grateful to the partnership between the four institutions, to the World Bank, and to you all, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and leaders of research and education. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud, for this brief introduction and welcoming address. May I just confirm on what you have said, that I think that if we can make the survey that you have mentioned among the students in university, I think it will be better results, because we have started, as you have said, with our solid partnership with the centers of think tanks. We have started many awareness campaign among the students, and I think there is we have some students here maybe joining us today, and they are keen to know and to hear also for Dr. Montek. And Dr. Montek, you are most welcome, dear sir. Dr. Montek Ahluwalia is the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, former first Director of Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF. He was also the Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance in India, Special Secretary to the Prime Minister in India. He has published a number of articles on the Indian economy. And in 2011, Dr. Ahluwalia was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India, which is India's second highest civilian honor for public service. And we have the pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Dr. Montek, in your paper, Financing Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation in Developing Countries, you have tackled the idea of developing and developed countries who are currently facing economic and geopolitical crisis, in addition to the impact of climate change. And you have found that the key to address these challenges is the collective responsibility of all stakeholders. May I ask you, in this regard, how could COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh build on the major steps taken since COP21 in Paris 2015 and COP26 in Glasgow last year? The floor is yours.
Yep. Well, can I be heard? Yeah. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Adla, for kicking this off. And let me begin by saying what a great honor and pleasure it is that the participating institutions have invited me to give this talk on a subject that both you and I regard very important. Now, we agreed with Adla that she was going to raise some pointed questions so that you don't get a long lecture, but you actually get answers to questions which she tells me you really want. Is coming through? No.
The voice is not clear. Okay.
That's what I thought.
No. Dr. Hella, can you take mine?
Is that, I think, yeah. Is that better? Okay. So let me focus on this question that what's important about COP27 in the aftermath of COP26 only a year ago. Now, one thing is, as I think has already been mentioned, COP27 is happening at a time when really the global situation has changed quite dramatically from what it was 1 year ago. And there are several reasons for that. We're kind of all coming out of the pandemic, and that sort of created a big contraction during the pandemic. Then it's led to a bit of a recovery, but it's still not very clear what the post-recovery growth rate is going to be. We're in an environment where the central banks of the world have taken very strong action in order to combat inflation, which has in Western countries gone to very high levels. And that has obviously increased the probability that the world will slip into a recession. Now, these economic problems are difficult enough, but it's happening at a time when pretty deep geopolitical fractures have appeared in the world. Two factors have emphasized that. Clearly, the Russian-Ukrainian events, Russia's invasion of Ukraine with no early signs of a solution, have disrupted, quite apart from the human cost, they've disrupted supply chains and jacked up prices or energy prices all over the world. And further east, the new postures taken by China, a sort of muscular nationalism, along with a direct competitive threat to the United States. The official policy of the Chinese government is that they want to compete with the United States, not only economically, but also militarily and technologically. This has created concerns which have led the US to take action against China, trade action, technology restriction, etc. And all of this is very different from the functioning of what earlier would have been called a sort of seamless globalization. So I think COP27 is happening at an exceptionally difficult time. Climate change is a very, very important long-term phenomenon. And even if the short-term situation was stable and predictable, handling climate change would involve a lot of very difficult decisions. And they're costly decisions. And in a way, while the top leadership of the world kind of recognizes that climate change is an existential threat and that we really must take some tough decisions, there doesn't seem to be the willingness to actually take those decisions. And that contrast is very marked because, for a long time on climate change, people have been saying, we must get away from fossil fuels, we must impose a tax on fossil fuels, raise the price of fossil fuels to reflect the social cost of fossil fuels, etc. Now, the Russia-Ukraine problem has actually jacked up the cost of fossil fuels. But the reaction is not, oh, that's good, that's exactly what we wanted. Now we must do more to produce renewable energy. The reaction is, let's go back to fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So quite honestly, around the world, it's easy to talk elementary economics. It's very difficult to actually put it in practice. I mean, we know that from our countries, but the difference now is that even the richer countries are demonstrating this conflict. So this is just a background. Now, in the light of that background, what is it, let's say, under reasonable assumptions, what do people want from COP27? Now, as Mr. Mohieldin said, conferences come and go, and they're usually a great event, nice communiques are issued. There's an unwritten rule, I think, in international conferences that all international conferences are successful. Because at the end of an international conference, a lot of money is spent. So everybody who's organizing the international conference will have a great incentive to say, that was a tremendously successful conference, and I wish you well, and I think it would be fair to say that. But having given that general positive feel, let's ask, what are the 2 or 3 specific messages which might reassure people that we're moving forward? Now, I think COP26, I do believe, was an important development because, it was the first time ever that developing countries agreed that they must reduce their emissions down to 0. At different times of the year, some said 2050, China said 2060, India said 2070. But, all these countries were earlier saying that our development makes it impossible for us to agree on any reduction. So that was a big change. And everybody celebrated that. But now the question is, what do we do next? Well, I think there are three things that come out very clearly. And in a way, COP27 will be judged by how much progress is made on each of these 3. First, we knew, even in Glasgow, that while what has been promised in terms of bringing emissions down to 0 is very good, we knew that if all the countries were to achieve what they promised, we would not achieve the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Remember, we're already 1.1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial level. So the target was no more than 0.4% increase is possible. And let me say that, there's a reason for that. And the reason is, quite frankly, if we go much above that, we will see a big rise in sea levels. In fact, some of the current estimates suggest that the way we are going, by 2100, the sea level will rise by 2.5 meters. Now, the whole of the Republic of Kiribati will go underwater. And even the Maldives might go underwater because the highest spot in the Maldives is not higher than 2.5 meters. So small island countries will basically have to relocate their population. That's a very big challenge. It's not just the small island countries. In low-lying areas, recent research shows that there'll be a lot of coastal flooding with a permanent loss of area. That could happen in Bangkok, it could happen in Ho Chi Minh City, it could happen in the mangrove areas of Bangladesh. It could happen in the Pearl River Delta. So lots of loss of land, which would require people to be moved. Now, this would not be international migration. They would be moved within the same country. But if enough resources are not devoted to making this happen, we would run into very serious human problems. So from our point of view, it's very important that we stop this, or stop it as much as possible. I think the COP26 actually said that, look, what you've promised is not good enough, and people were told to come back in COP27 with stronger commitments. My understanding is only about 24 countries have actually made further commitments, and many of those commitments do not actually end up being stronger. They're just a slight redefinition. So the present prospect is that somehow the communique coming out of COP27 must give some signal that has the world actually agreed to take tougher action. The key here is who's to take that tougher action. And I would say that, we need a recognition on the part of the industrialized countries that they're the ones that have to do better than what they promised. Because we did some work in a paper that's on our website. And what that shows is that if you take the top 8 emitters, that includes India, US, China, EU, India, Russia, Brazil, and so on. These 8, if they were to go by what they have promised, they will use up 130% of the carbon budget for the whole world. Now, obviously, that is not fair. And so these countries have to be persuaded to move much faster. And my guess is that, amongst the biggest countries that needs to do better is really the United States, China, and Russia. Even the EU, because they are better than this group, and even India should do better. And my guess is that if these larger countries, richer countries agree to do better, there's a good chance within India that people will be able to persuade them, look, we should do better. And, maybe we should get to net zero by 2060 and not 2070. Maybe China should get there 2050 and not 2060. But if the major countries don't take those steps, there is no chance of any developing country offering to do more than what they've promised. So as a humble reader of communiques, Mahmoud, I'll be watching your communique to see what's the signal it gives on that. That's one point. The second, and that's actually a little more disturbing, is that, most countries have really not taken the actions needed to achieve the targets they themselves set. I mean, this is the second question, that how do we in COP 27 and 28 and 29 lead to credible targets? I feel that these net zero targets 50 years down the road are not very useful. I think what we need is to give a signal that every participant should indicate what will the emissions be over the next 10 years, let's say. I mean, COP27 is happening in 2022. So maybe COP27 could say that every participant will indicate where will its emissions be 10 years from now. That means, say, 2032. It's quite possible for the poorer countries, which have very low emissions per capita, like India and many others, that our emissions may actually rise a little. But if we are going to go to zero, which we say we are by 2070, then that rise must be offset by a decline. And it should then be possible to judge, are you on that path or not? That can only be done if you have some granular, detailed targets for the next 10 years. So that's my second feeling, that if COP27 can call for each country, it's not saying what the targets should be, but just call for each country to produce a medium-term granular target that we're going to do these 6 things, as a result of which our emissions by 2032 will only be so much. And I accept the fact that for some countries there'll be an increase, but for most countries, the richer ones, there should be a sharp decline. And we should indicate, what are we doing in order to bring about that decline? I mean, I say this in the context of what we are seeing today in Europe, because if there's a move back to coal and you start a new coal mine, which is going to take 40 years, you are prejudging what's going to happen to emissions. And I think this would be a useful thing. And the last point, and I know you're going to take more time, so I just mention it briefly. Yeah. And that is really money. A central point in the UNFCCC was that developing countries will need to be assisted in order to do both the mitigation and the adaptation. Developed countries have the resources, they'll do it themselves. China, I don't think, is asking for assistance. They say they'll do whatever they want to do themselves. But developing countries other than China do need this.
What about India? Could you elaborate?
Yeah, well, sorry, yeah, I'll tell you.
It's India really to hear about the Indian experience.
Well, okay, I think on India, I would say that the situation is somewhat similar to what I described earlier. Several actions have been taken. More renewable energy is being brought in. Solar energy, wind energy is proving to be quite competitive. Many of our corporations are now going in for things like green hydrogen, the larger corporations that can afford it. But the truth is that while we are bending the curve, I don't think we are bending it enough to reach the targets that we've set. So India is not different from the rest of the world. See, it's one of those things that if you want to take some satisfaction at the fact that something is happening, you can take a lot of satisfaction. If the question you're asking is enough happening, then I'm afraid not just for India, but nowhere, enough is not happening. And I think that's the real problem. That's why I think every country should let us know in 10 years, where do you expect to be? But, coming back to money, the whole discussion on money has been focused on this $100 billion a year, which, as the OECD and others say, have not yet been achieved. It was meant to be done by 2030 and then continued. It hasn't been done. The COP26 kind of set a target that let's get it done by 2024 and then think beyond that for more. So obviously COP27 and COP28 are not going to make any decisions on amounts because the 100 billion still stays. But I think we need to think about what is the scale that we need now. And that scale, quite frankly, is phenomenal. I mean, there's been some work done, and I think Nick Stern and Veera Sangwe of the UN are putting forward a paper to the COP27 conference, and they're using some studies, which we're also using, and referring now to what the work I've done. Our conclusion from those studies is that developing countries will need an additional about $1 trillion compared to 2019 by 2025. So compared to 2019, an extra $1 trillion. Now, some of that will come automatically because the economies grow, etc. But you'll still have a significant, the additional is 1,300 billion, and some will come automatically, and what is left is 1 trillion. So that's a gap that has to be filled. And one of the important things we say, we have to accept, and I don't know if developing countries will accept it. We cannot realistically say that all of this must come from international finance. I mean, that would be a 7 to 8-fold increase in international funding. It's just not going to happen. We have to recognize that half of this maybe will come domestically, because after all, these projections are based on accelerated growth, and accelerated growth will generate its own momentum. Plus, there have to be reallocation from some of the things we do now, non-productive subsidies, etc., move it into things that would actually help the transition. So if half comes from there, that still leaves you $500 million. And I think the key point we make is that quite a bit of that can come from private finance. Maybe 300 million, something like that can come from private finance. 200 million will have to come from public flows, mainly from the multilateral development banks. And I think we make one other point, which is very important, and that is that this is not just a question that because the multilateral development banks are giving some money, that the private sector has to do less. We think that the private sector will not come unless the multilateral development banks do a lot of preparation and de-risking and policy change that will persuade the private sector that governments are really serious. So this is a very big job for the multilateral development banks to perform. And I'm hoping that from the COP27 communique, some signal will go that we now expect the multilateral development banks to get into the business of triggering public finance and leveraging private finance, two different things. I mean, the leveraging cannot be done if you've got no skin in the game. I mean, you can't put $5 million on the table and get 600 million from the private sector. But if you're putting 200 million on the table, you probably can get an extra 300 million from the private sector. That requires a signal that has to go from heads of government. And normally, in COP is not the occasion when issues of multilateral development banks are discussed. That's normally done in the G20, but all the top people will be there in COP27, so they can carry that momentum forward. I think this is very critical because this 100 billion that is being talked about, and there's a lot of talk that it hasn't been achieved, this is irrelevant. The background of the 100 billion is that in 2009, when no developing country had agreed to any reduction in emissions, the maximum they were able to do was to get some developing countries, including India and China, that we will reduce the emissions intensity of GDP, but in return, we'll provide some money, and 100 billion was an arbitrary figure. It is not linked to any estimation of the cost of what would have to be done, because the amount of emissions reduction was never quantified. Now that time has gone, because now we have an estimate of what developing countries have to do in order to get to net zero. I've mentioned the figure of 1 trillion, half coming from domestic side. Now, in that context, the public flows have to go up to about $250 billion or so every year. So it's not just the 100 billion, it has to be multiples of that. If we get such a signal, I think it will be major forward movement. I might say that, you know, developing countries themselves are a little bit to blame, because they have never talked about getting this money from multilateral development banks. Because in the COPs are run by ministries of environment, the UN, and they believe in the Green Climate Fund. So in the back of mind of the negotiators is that MDBs are bad because they put in conditionality, harsh, etc., and we'll get it from the Green Climate Fund without conditions. Now, actually, the leveraging of the private sector is only going to come if some conditions are added that make the sectors worth investing in. So in many ways, the conditionality that the MDBs bring, in my view, is actually critical for making the investment attractive to the private sector, because the private sector thinks, aha, these fellows are going to do all these reforms. Now, what those reforms should be is a matter to be negotiated. But the idea that all this money is going to come from the Green Climate Fund, forget it. The Green Climate Fund was funded at about $10 billion. That's not an annual figure, it's a total figure for several years. It'll be funded a little bit more. It's nowhere on the scale needed to achieve the financing objective. Those are the main things that my good friend Mahmoud is smiling, so I'm confident that he'll put it into the communique somehow. But, you know, if some indication that we move forward, and I don't expect this to be resolved, because, you know, these are huge sums of money and you don't expect this to be done instantly. But if people say that at some level there's now a recognition that this is what needs to be done, then you live to fight another day. And frankly, this is a long-term game. This is not something that was going to be either solved or not solved at Sharm el-Sheikh. Well, those are my... I'm sorry I've taken too long.
No, you're just in time. Thank you very much. And we hope that the COP27 would reach some solutions concerning the multilateral focus on the common input of mitigation in the future, which becomes a crucial component. Thank you very much. And I believe maybe Dr. Khalid Fahmy, former minister, want to give some words concerning Dr. Khalid Fahmy. It's the Egypt's former Minister of Environment and Professor of Environmental Economics at the Institute of National Planning. And Dr. Khalid, how do you conceive Dr. Montek words for promulgating the combination of additional domestic efforts, which almost half of the additional investment raised from the domestic resources and international flows to meet the climate change? So,
good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you, World Bank. Thank you, Institute of National Planning. Thank you, Economic Resource Research Center. Thank you all for having me with you today. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. So, and thank you, Dr. Monique, for the very interesting and stimulating presentation that you have made. You have touched on the very important basic issue, the COP27, but for climate change. Let me start by maybe identifying myself. On which side do I? There are different groups when it comes to expert. There are different groups in addressing these things. I believe that climate change requires a system change. Okay. climate change is only one symptom of the existing division of labor, the international side. So it's a part of a whole, and you cannot address part and leave the whole, because then you will be always addressing with partial solution and with even if it's long term, but with an aspirin that you are trying to treat cancer with an aspirin. That's where I come from. Thank you very much for the ideas that you are conveying to us, and in particularly that developing countries will be asked to pay more. Now, if you go through the history of COPs, we have 26 COPs until now. So it's more than 30 years of negotiations. You can predict a trend that we agree on something and then it dilutes over time. Basically, depending on the interest of the developed world. You can see this, for example, we started by the historical responsibility. Now nobody talks anymore about it. Historical. Even the UN has agreed that this is not the issue. We can see and I agree with that there is a common but differentiated responsibility. Yes, but Article 9, added to the Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, have clarified that it will be assistance coming from the developed world to the emerging economies and the less developed countries. And that, I was in Paris. Egypt at that time was speaking for Africa and leading the African delegation. I was deep into these negotiations. And that was one of the things that all of the developing countries have agreed to. If we are going to declare that we will go for mitigation activity and reduce our emission, then the condition is that we will get more money, more resources. And it was not even that time, it was to be provided by public money, by countries, because UNFCCC is an agreement between countries. It's not an agreement between countries and private sector. So it was, let's call it country. Then a year later, and before COP 2022, I think even after 22, we were called by the President Macron, and I was representing Egypt on the part of the President, His Excellency the President, and we were astonished that to be informed that most of the money is not going to come from public money, it's going to come from private money. Now we know that private, this means business, this means project, this means profit. This means somebody will have to pay the cost at the end. And we were told that up to 20% can come from public, but 80% will come from the private sector. And then later on, we had the COVID, we had the USA pulling out of the agreement, and then COVID retreated, the Democratic took power, and we came to the COP26, and we were asked to be ambitious when they were preparing, and UK had 2 years to prepare for the conference. Egypt has 1 so they had 2 years to prepare for it, and the whole issue was raise ambitious. To tell you the truth, we didn't know ambitious of whom. I mean, I was thinking maybe ambitious of the developed world to start transferring the money, or at least paying for the royalty for renewable energy or whatever. But it was that we should, the developing countries will come with more mitigation and more reduction. Okay. Nothing mentioned on more fund the old famous $100 billion I've been dreaming of 5-6 years when I was going to COPs. I was always dreaming of the 100 billion. I didn't know how they look like. I mean, I proposed this was a big thing coming. I don't know. So anyway, but we were dreaming of this. Never comes. I mean, and then there is always some accounting tricks, because the OECD report says clearly that 80%, 83%, I think, has been already transferred, where the Oxfam is saying 19 to 20. And if you look at what happened is that there were no additional money. This is the old development funding, but it has been put in green. Just like what we're doing now in Egypt, we're making everything green. Whatever that takes. It takes more than just saying we're green. It takes real restructuring internally and globally, which is not happening. We'll come to that later. But the situation is, and as rightly Dr. Montek said, all the reports that is following up on the commitments and pledges that were raised in COP26, and we know that COP26 was not ambitious and did not. It's a one step on the road, but it did not reach us much more than we were before. But the truth is that the follow-up, all the reports that have been now from NGOs and from nonprofit organization, academic, is saying that 90% of these things did not materialize. Mr. John Kerry, the US Secretary, was here in Egypt and did clarify that what we have reached is only 60 to 65% of what we need to reduce emission so that we don't exceed the 1.5 degree by end of the century. So, I mean, all of the world, didn't do a good job to come closer to the kind of reductions that was needed. Not to mention to enhance and foster collaboration. On the contrary, we're having big fractions in cooperation. And I don't see how the G8 was 7 now because they excluded Russia, but I don't think they will exclude it when it comes to emissions. They are excluded when it comes to decisions, but when it comes to emission, it's included. They have to work on it. So the G7, right, is still, most of them do not have policies, as Dr. Montek rightly said, not only the G7, but all over the world. What's missing is we have long-term goals, 2050, 2060, 2070, but we don't have plan and actions and program and policy for the next 10 years. EU was able to do it even before the 26th COP. US just recently and in September has issued the Inflation Reduction Act, which, if implemented within the next 10 years, it will bring them very close to their commitment on reduction of emissions. So most of the countries do not have policies and programs, but we're being asked to be ambitious. So there is a lot of talk, but we don't walk the talk. So my understanding is, and what I'm guessing is, COP27, as you have mentioned, right, it comes under severe abnormal conditions. I mean, how could you agree now on anything? Regardless whether it is COP27 or climate change, how could you agree on anything? It's about impossible. And we need the G7 to agree on a lot of things. One of them is finance, of course. So COP27 will be faced with a lot of challenges. I sense from what I'm hearing is that Mr. Kerry, Sir John Kerry, in an interview with the Egyptian TV, has declared, when he was asked, because the moderator was very enthusiastic, and he was talking about the projects and the investment and all this stuff. So we told him, wait. This is not a decision COP. This is a follow-up COP. Okay, so let's follow up. As said, most of the countries, even the one that presented new NDC, they mostly are conditioned. We are not going to do that unless we have the resources. But as Dr. Malik said, there is not too much resources in the pipeline. So finance is the most important issue. And what we're going to happen, most probably, we're going to talk about finance. We're going to talk about new ideas and new mechanisms. But the real issues for finance was discussed, for example, in the World Bank and in the IMF last September. The real reforms that Germany has submitted, we need reform. And if we want to be ambitious, we need reform. Reform does start with the G7, and it trickles down to us. But we need reform. Yes, we need that a part of the finance comes from domestically. Yes, especially if you go to all NDCs, they have concentrated on the win-win project that's part of the economic development, but they are green. Renewable energy, green transport, green hydrogen. Of course, this is a win-win thing. With the R&D happening now for hydrogen, green hydrogen, it will be a source of thermal energy that you need for big industries. Yes, it will be. But now we will talk mainly the issue. We will talk maybe on some new initiative on mechanisms, but I don't think nothing is going to happen in increasing a kind of fund. This is not going to happen. This is going to happen maybe in Emirates later, guys, but it's not going to happen this. The other thing of mitigation and adaptation, yes, the good thing is the light at the end of the tunnel is the loss and damage. For the first time in 26, we have agreed on finding a language, a suitable language for loss and damage. And we can see that Denmark, a few weeks ago, they have adopted the loss and damage, which was always a red line. Nobody talks about loss and damage in COP27. It's taboo. You just don't mention. I mean, when you mention this, people go out of the hole. So loss and damage, and that's what we really need, guys, loss and damage. I am not looking at what's going to happen in G7. I am looking at what's happening in developing countries. I am looking into the V20, the vulnerable 20s. I'm looking into the minister, Maya from Papadarius, and the Bridgetown Declaration. These are the things that really reflects what the developing world is doing. I come from a developing country, and I belong there. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for maybe taking more of my time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled. Ending your talk about the suitable language of loss and damage, and is COP27 would give real or hope or dreams. I will open the question and answer for the floor and for our colleagues on the internet at the Zoom. So we will start first with the floor. Okay, Dr. Abla, Dr. Ali Sliman. Okay, Dr. Abla, the mic, please, for Dr. Abla. Please, question or comments, just more than 2 minutes.
Less than 2.
Okay, great.
Just 2 quick questions. Thank you very much for an excellent speech and very deep thoughts about what is expected in COP27 and good notes for Egypt, I can say. I have 2 quick questions for you. First one, there is something that's a little bit, I think, confusing for Egypt. And I noticed that when having webinars with a lot of people from Africa. Africa is expecting Egypt to be the voice of Africa and go with very strong messages helping the continent. But at the same time, it is said that it's an international conference. It's not about Africa alone. How can Egypt do this, delicate balance? That's the first question. The second question, how can the carbon market achieve climate justice? And I'm not talking about the mitigation in the future. I'm not talking about benefiting from it at the commercial level. I'm talking about improving the existing justice by having compensation. Can it be done? And if so, what are the obstacles? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abla. Dr. Abla Abdel Latif, head of our partner ECES, partner in the group organizing this lecture. Would you like, sir, to have all the question and then answer, or question by question?
That might be easier. Okay, I'll just make notes.
Okay. So we take another question, or you want to reply to this? Okay. Okay, it's Dr. Ali Sliman and then Dr. Yusuf.
Yeah, being a former professor, so I cannot speak.
Dr. Ali Sliman, professor of economics.
And the former Undersecretary for International Cooperation. I welcome, of course, the distinguished speakers and welcome to Egypt. I think one of the big benefits of these COPs and meetings is to raise awareness about the issue of climate. I'm afraid if we are talking about money and commitments by rich countries to poor countries, we forget the responsibilities that we all have in dealing with the climate. I'm afraid the countries like even Egypt, Brazil, India are also pollutants, and they create a lot of issues as far as the preservation of the green environment, the woods, and so on. We observe cutting trees for cooking and for other things. We have now cities in the third world without gardens or parks. And I think if we raise awareness about this, and I look forward to our own media to be interested in this subject, we have to teach small children how to save water, how to save the environment, and so on. And if we can use this occasion to remind people of the importance of this issue is important. I don't want it to be, having worked before in the World Bank and other international agencies, I don't want it to be a matter of aid. I think it's a matter of collaboration and responsibility, joint responsibilities. And I had expected Professor Montek to speak some more about what India has done in the area of preservation and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be in this forum, and we are happy also to be at the Economic Research Forum, participating in this and sponsoring this very interesting talk. For the professor, I'm just intrigued about the reality that you bring to the forum. I think you are very practical, and you said things that a lot of people will move around it. How about the humming and the noise about the carbon debt swap or the climate debt swap? There's a lot of noise now about how the less developed country will be able to swap their debts for projects that are financing climate mitigation or whatever. How do you see that, and what is your practical, your real assessment of such noise, so to speak?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sihan Farouk, Ministry of Finance. I have two questions. The first is about carbon market. Its mechanism for emission trading system is perfect and efficient in European Union, especially in European Union. How about using such mechanism, but among the countries? For example, when we think about discussing during COP24 that each country has to reveal or commit its annual reduction plan. Afterwards, we have a committee from UN, for example, to follow up this implementation plan. Will country or this country not can't do this reduction, maybe it can be price for each ton they can produce. And this money can be go to a dedicated fund for developing countries that may be used in projects and green projects. This is a proposal for Dr. Mahmoud. The second one is about making use of the already existing green climate funds, global green climate funds. It has a lot of conditions to be accessed, and not a lot of countries know about it. I think facilitated entity or can have a committee for this to facilitate this issue for countries and some countries about it to facilitate access for funds.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Montek, would you like to reply on this?
I can reply to some of these points.
Yes, and then we have another round. Okay.
But first, let me answer the question about what has India done, because coming from India, I think my comparative advantage is maybe telling you what has happened in India. So, I would say that historically, we took the same position that developing countries did. That, look, the accumulation of emissions has not been caused by us. It's been caused by you fellows, and you have to take care of it. And, we really cannot have any great responsibility. But, over time, as our economies grew, as our levels of emissions increased, India's emissions are about 1/3 the average of the world, but India is still the 4th largest emitter. So the idea that we will somehow get away with not doing anything is not credible. There are no perfect solutions. I think you asked the question about what is climate justice. It's very different. I mean, I'm actually not going to answer the question because it's virtually impossible to get an agreement. Life is unfair. And therefore, this is true today. If you're a poor country, you're treated very unfairly. And quite frankly, you can only appeal on the grounds of charity. And that has some benefit. But as somebody said, you don't like aid, it should be collaboration. I think we recognized in India that we cannot get away with making no commitment. In fact, within India, I had written a paper about before COP26 that India should agree to some emissions reduction. And I said, look, if China is agreeing to emissions reduction to 0 by a certain date, we could always say that, look, we'll also go to 0 when our per capita income reaches China's by the date when they said they'll go to 0. Actually, if we had said that, we wouldn't have to go down to 0 until 2080 or something. But these things become, again, you have to negotiate. I was very happy that our Prime Minister, by the way, before the Prime Minister in COP26 announced that we are going to go to net 0 in 2070, none of his officials was actually willing to consider it. The general official advice was that where is climate justice? Why are these fellows asking us to do these things, etc.? Let us simply say, you put your money on the table, then we'll talk. I think he rightly took the decision that when you're a big country, you got to show that you also care. And so he put down this 2070. I've subsequently been writing that it's good that we are saying 2070. But one of the problems with 2070 is that whatever you do in the next 5 years, you can always say, we'll get to 0 by 2070. That's not very useful. So we should have, in my view, a sectorally detailed granular plan where you indicate in each sector exactly what you're going to do for the next 10 years, which is broadly in line with your objective. Now, for example, in India in the next 10 years, the total emissions cannot be reduced, but the growth has to be sharply reduced. And maybe after that, you should indicate we're going to peak by a certain period and then start going down. You know, to achieve that, we have to do many difficult things. Like, for example, stop any more coal plants. You know, coal-fired power plant has a life of 40 years. So if we keep adding coal-based power plants, then there's no point in saying that we're going to reduce emissions. If you're serious about reducing emissions, you have to say that for future power capacity, it's going to be renewables, solar and wind. And India has set targets for something like 450 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity should come up by 2030. Now, that's a very specific target that makes sense. They are trying to do electrification of vehicles, but we have not yet set a target of how rapidly are we going to electrify. So obviously, you know, in all these things, if the test is, are you doing something, you can always do something. But the real point is, if you set yourself the target in India that you want to go to net zero in 2070, there are certain hard to abate sectors where it will be very difficult to do away with fossil fuel. But certainly in transport, the technology exists. The whole thing could become electric. So make up your mind. If the whole fleet is going to be electric by 2050, and if the typical vehicle in India lasts for about 15 years before being retired, then 100% of vehicle sales by 2035 should be electric. At the moment, only about 2% are. So to go from 2 to 100 within 12, 13 years is possible, but we should set that target. If for no other reason, it's only when you set these targets that you learn how close are you to achieving them. I'm sure that initially we will be over-optimistic, then it will turn out that we're not getting there, etc. So I could give you a long list of things which never used to happen before and are happening.
Thank you.
You know,
Thank you. We can just
cut it down.
No. We can just welcome Her Excellency, the Minister of Economic.
Just to say, a lot of things are happening in India, but I feel that we need to have targets where we can tell when are we going to peak and how are we then going to go down. We haven't yet done that, but maybe we'll get to it. Now, some of the other questions. You know, the question about Africa and Egypt leading, I think that's a very important point because Egypt has a unique position in international negotiations, and Africa does need a voice. And, you know, frankly, given the population growth, the numbers in Africa in the next 20 years are going to be huge. So somebody must be a voice for Africa, and I would congratulate the Egyptian government if they take that on. They do need a voice. But, you know, what you'll achieve out of that, this is very uncertain at the moment because the world is quite tight with money. But somebody must hear that and I think the second point, I did say, for example, that half of what is needed must come for the developing countries. That is what the average of all developing countries. Now, the poorest countries, they don't have to do half. And frankly, for the very poor countries, the amount of emissions is quite small. But certainly India should be doing half, and maybe some of the richer countries should be doing more than half. So, you know, those are matters of detail. But like I would say that after COP27, each country should do an exercise that, look, what is the investment that we need in order to achieve the transition we are talking about? Where's this extra money going to come from? How much are we going to do ourselves and how much do we need internationally? So something like that, it must be done country by country. You can only call for it right now, but you know, this is a 30-year plan. So we shouldn't think that it's going to be achieved in 1 year. I mean, raising awareness, COP role. I think, international conferences only raise awareness internationally. The next step is leaders should take what comes out of COP. And when they go back home, they should say, I have promised on your behalf, in the Indian case, that we are going to go to net zero by 2070. And let me tell you what that means. That means a simple thing in India's case is that we have to indicate a reduction in coal production. I'm quite sure that our Ministry of Coal is still working on growth. Ministries don't plan to reduce coal production. Leaders need to make it clear that things are going to have to be different. And I think that will come providing the COP message becomes granular. It's only when you go back to your own country and say, on your behalf, I have committed X, Y, and Z. Then somebody will say, well, how are you going to do it? And then you can say, I'm going to ask the World Bank to fund it, whatever, etc. I think those were the main questions that I...
Thank you. We'll have another round, but after welcoming Her Excellency, Dr. Hala Saeed, Minister of Planning and Economic Development. And we would like to hear a small word from your side, Hala.
ماسكه كده
Well, good evening. First, I'd like to apologize for being late and to miss this distinguished panel, and I'm very happy to be and pleased to be among this distinguished panelists. And with this audience, I'd like to start by expressing my appreciation, of course, to Dr. Ashraf Al-Arabi, ex-Minister of Planning and the chair of the National Institute of Planning, and of course to all the board of directors and to the distinguished panelists for inviting me to be part of this panel. Let me start by highlighting or stressing on two main dimensions. The first is the issue of financing the green transition. And the second one is what are the efforts that we are doing on financing green transition in Egypt specifically. Actually, with all the multiple shocks that the world is facing, the issue of finance has been always actually a key challenge for green transition. But now with what the world is facing from the geopolitical challenges and the multiple shocks that it's facing, it is becoming really a major limitation for the transition, the green transition. This is being demonstrated by limitations on the affordable financing mechanisms, which actually have existed even before the downturn and the challenges that we are facing. Actually, of course, the challenges have weighed down all the domestic resources, and it actually have shaken the confidence of foreign investors, which has been definitely exacerbated by all the recent crises. According to the UNFCCC report, climate finance gap is between 2.5 to 4.8 trillion US dollars. And actually trying to bridge this gap for the next 10 years to 2030, actually 8 or 10 years, would require an additional 160 to 300 billion US dollars, based on current investment projects, current investment estimates. Of course, this shortfall have been affecting both developed and developing countries, and this scale of investment requires basically around 4 to 8% of the GDP annually of the developing and emerging economies. To add to this, Africa will need a cumulative climate finance of up to around 1.6 trillion US dollar, and this translates into an average of 128 billion US dollars annually during that period from now to 2030. Of course, this heightens the pressure on developing countries and, of course, their main ability to fulfill their development objective and their development needs. This challenge requires an evidence-based approach. It requires basically effective institutions. It requires more well-coordinated policies, and also it requires basically substantial increase in investments, because most of the developing and emerging economies came out of the COVID pandemic with soaring external debt rates. So what we really need is not more loans, is not more concessional loans, but what we need is more investments for the developing and emerging economies. On the other hand, further, the transparency of these financial flows must be enhanced to ensure that the developing economies ensure their predictability for the movement of the capital, and also for developing countries to set and monitor their progress in their development agenda. Of course, this can be only fulfilled if we have adequate support from developed economies to the developing and emerging economies, and this also can be enhanced by support of technology, transfer, capacity building, and new and additional concessional loans and investment. The second dimension, or the second point I'd like to highlight, is and I'd like to first thank Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, because last year, or the past 18 months, we have launched for the first time a report, the Finance for Development report. This was the first Finance for Development report to be basically to elaborate the efforts in one country. Usually the Finance for Development report is a global report. This was the first country report to be done in Egypt. It was pioneered, of course, chaired by the efforts of Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, with a group of independent, more than 27 independent experts that have done the report with different policy recommendations for developing and emerging economies, and specifically Egypt, provide an objective and in-depth analysis of the wide range of opportunities in Egypt, and of course wide range of development finance initiative that Egypt can use. Basically, the discussion or the analysis of the need for more blended finance, for sustainable bonds, SDG bonds, and other sources of different variety of finance for developing countries. The other thing is that Egypt, during the past few years, also has focused its efforts on creating inclusive growth through many initiatives. First, we had strengthened the role of the private sector through two main lines, basically establishing for the first time a sovereign wealth fund for Egypt, which is basically a reliable mechanism that its main role is to crowd in the private sector, not to crowd out the private sector. It looks for different investment opportunities, to transfer these investment opportunities into investment products and offer these products to a private sector, whether local or international. For example, we have made a call for water desalination projects in partnership with the private sector. This call that we had, we received 300 offers from 30 countries to work on to implement the water desalination project the water desalination basically the water desalination station for Egypt. As I said, 300 offers. We received 300 offers from 30 different countries. This is basically a transfer of technology. It is FDI in addition to localization of industries, because all the offers and all the calls that we have done through the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Egypt, it's basically calling international investors that they come with technology transfer. And one of the main criteria for shortlisting these investors are basically localizing industry and localizing components of this industry in Egypt. So this is the first thing. The second thing is that also we have amended the law of the public partnership law. We have tried through this amendment to avoid all the challenges that we had in the previous law, to make this private-public partnership procedures more friendly for the private sector. The other important thing is that despite all the challenges that the world has been facing globally during the past few years since the corona pandemic, Egypt was basically doubled its FDI. It increased about 53%, reaching almost close to $9 billion US. And this is, of course, is a vote of confidence to the Egyptian investment climate in Egypt during the past few years. Regarding Egypt hosting the COP27, the Egyptian government is making great strides in confronting climate change by shifting towards a green, sustainable economy. We have made great progress in increasing the share of renewable energy in the energy mix, from 20% in 2022 to reach almost 42% in 2035. Also, we have issued at the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development, in collaboration with the Ministry of Environment, we have issued for the first time environmental sustainability criteria in order for different public institutions to abide by this criteria. This entailed a lot of capacity building for the government employees. Last year, we have reached, in last fiscal year, we have reached 30% of our projects were green. We're targeting to reach 40% of our projects to become green this year. And we have a target to reach 50% of the projects to become green. Mostly these projects are related to transportation, to EVs, electronic vehicles, and in addition to projects related to agriculture and rationalization of water. Finally, I would like to highlight some key messages. One, challenges facing the promotion of sustainable finance development in Egypt are no longer related to the inefficient distribution of resources available for projects that accelerate the achievement of the 2030 agenda, rather to a lack of available funding worldwide, available investment and concessional finance worldwide. And this shortage was exacerbated by repeated and multiple shocks in the global economy, which affected both developed and developing countries. Second, we should all work to change and shape the priorities of global economy through using more innovative financing tools and solutions to reduce the burden on middle and developing countries. Third, the state prioritizes sustainable finance and strives to align public investment with the principles of green economy. And I don't know, talking about solutions, I don't know if Dr. Mahmoud have talked to you about the initiative on the national initiative on green and smart projects. And this is actually an innovative solution to move and engage the local level into the green transformation and the green transition, because I do believe that the real development happens at the root, at the local level, not from the top. So this actually initiative that was initiated by the non-state actor, the Climate Champion, basically engages all governorates, all people at the local level to start thinking about green and smart projects. It has 6 dimensions, basically mega projects, middle and small and micro projects, projects related to female, climate sensitive projects from the civil society, and startups and youth. So there is a lot, although the initiative was launched less than 70 days ago, but we had a lot of training and capacity building to a lot of public and civil servants and a lot of local people at different governorates. It had a lot of engagement and enthusiasm from the 26 governorates, and we hope to launch this and have the winning projects on next Thursday before the COP, and this will be a yearly initiative, and it will, we hope to move this from the local level to the regional and to the global level, inshallah, to become one of Egypt's moving from the local to a global perspective. Finally, Egypt is a climate vulnerability hotspot, despite it contributes the least to the GHG emissions. Egypt is exerting a lot of effort to achieve fair and balanced outcomes, to adopt the climate change in Africa, and definitely all efforts to adopt climate transition cannot reverse the hard gain efforts in the development. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Dr. Hala Saeed, for your informative speech, and stressing on the initiative happen from local, hopefully till global. And I believe Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin wants to add. Okay, after more questions. Do you have questions? You have some people on the Zoom. Okay, thank you. Dr. Shireen from the ERF, our partner also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to convey the questions from our online participants. We have some 100 participants online. So if I may, first question, it's actually a mix of questions to Dr. Montek Ahluwalia and to Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin as well. Do you think that FDI can fill the gap of financing to Egypt, and how to make it sustainable? And is hot money a good alternative for FDI? Do all these actions, can they work for Egypt? And what about mobilizing the national savings? Can it fill the gap, and to what extent? Another question that was from Dr. Ali Rashid. From Dr. Ali Aouni, I'm not sure of your definition of finance here. Does it include grants too? Nor not your typical loans and investments? If this is true, what is the role of philanthropy and ODIs, at least in a blended format? There's a question from Dr. Yasmin Abdel Fattah. Are these climate finances going to assist in adapting to natural disasters, especially that, for example, flooding's number of people hit has increased 3 times since 1990? From Kate Fellenberg, is a required percentage of national budgets dedicated to climate change mitigation efforts from the G20 nations a possibility, as opposed to contributions to a fund, a set annual percentage? And on the private sector side, could central banks require a percentage of private bank investments be dedicated to climate change investments, such as AU member central banks require, at least on paper, 10% of their nation's private banks go towards agriculture investments? from Professor Atif Qobrosi. He has a very a comment. The developed countries have to invest in the less developed countries programs of adaptation and mitigation, but equally important and maybe more challenging is the need for the developed countries to yield growth and even stop growth in their economies so that poor countries can catch up without frying our planet. There is no escape from reducing emissions to maintain the 1.5 degrees warming without ending growth before ending us all. From Dr. Muhammad Ali, as we're talking about the road to COP27, what is the main aims which Egypt trying to achieve? While these are the current huge challenges, example, political, geopolitical, global economic crisis, what we can say that the COP27 passed successfully. Final other question is from Professor Mahmoud Haddad. What is the impact of the ongoing wars on the environment? And there was a suggestion on that came in English and Arabic. So there's a lot of interest and keenness in that. What could we as citizens in Egypt and India do to work together to participate in saving the earth? And how developing countries can convince developed countries and multilateral organizations to participate in financing the cost of climate change. And this was the end. To the last one. Okay. From Dr. Adel Shawi, they keep coming in as I was as Dr. Montek and Dr. Fahmy mentioned concerning a clear, definitive action plan for the next 10 years. Could it be for less time, for 5 years, for example, with a maximum GHG emissions ceiling figure that is self-set, projected, declared by each state in advance through their NDCs or integrated reports based on their ongoing mega emitting.
Thank you, Dr. Shireen, and thank you, Dr. Hala, Your Excellency. I know that you came just for us in the middle of a board meeting, and thank you very much. She's very keen to be with us. Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Montek, I will give you the floor just to answer. Okay. to share. Okay, Dr. Mahmoud will.
No, yeah, I think
because yeah. We have only 15 minutes.
All right,
we have to end.
I know that Dr. Ahluwalia will need all the time, so I'll be very brief, and we're here to listen to him. And many thanks again for your excellent remarks earlier. Let me share the following just to have a kind of cumulative narrative of the 3 events ending today with this very good discussion with Dr. Ahluwalia. I think we started with a very good point in the first session where Stephen mentioned to us that there is no trade-off between climate and development. And if you are in doubt, finance will get us together at the end because we're going to be facing a finance constraint. So that is very useful from him about synergies that Stephen alleged in his first lecture to us. On the second, of course, he said much more, but I'm trying just to get what's relevant to our discussion today on the substance of the discussion. Then with Professor Duflo, she mentioned in order to deal with climate change, and this is, I'm trying to take it in the context of proposing solutions for a COP. All right. Okay. Should I wait until recording comes back again, starts again? All right. So it will come if you are worried about the recording. At the 3 main messages from Professor Duflo are about, for a COP, focusing on implementation, linking it again to poverty and development, that we need science research and development, this one. Second, there is an issue related to finance, which Dr. Ahluwalia mentioned, and then behavioral change. And of course, with behavioral change comes a variety of matters, including communication, cultural change should be supported. One of the most fascinating chapters in the book by Amartya Sen on the title Argumentative Indian was about culture and communication, the presence of a minister of communication here, and that we need to change culture. And I think this is one of the ways, starting perhaps including the economists, the development specialists, but definitely we need a big issue here of work to be handled when it comes to cultural change and how that's going to be felt. Perhaps the exercise that the Minister of Planning just mentioned about localization of climate action and how to engage society in different levels, and big events are going to be there on an annual basis. The whole governance in our country are going to be engaged. That could be a useful part, at least on the business and the community development side. But it depends really where you go. I bet that our friends in Alexandria in the north are very much exposed to the reality of the threat. And in my discussion yesterday with the students and staff of that university, I think they manage really to capture the kind of threats and challenges, but they need the solutions. The solutions will come on the finance front, and that's basically what I'm going to focusing on, assuming that there will be more science to help us and better communication and better engagement. On the finance, I think Dr. Ahluwalia put the 100 billion in a context because the gaps are in the trillions. The 100 billion, actually our Minister of Foreign Affairs yesterday said, well, same thing, it's going to be helpful to get that, but that will not bridge the gap. But he takes it as a kind of token of trust, because you cannot trust what will happen post-2024 unless you get what was promised since 2009 fulfilled. And that had never been the case. Being a reader of different reports, if you are asking me to believe the figures coming from the OECD and or the figures coming from Oxfam, developing countries' interest is basically to be more interested in the reports coming from Oxfam, which is about the 22%, rather than the 83% mentioned by Minister Khalid earlier, when he quoted the OECD report and the Oxfam report, which you have as well in your chapter, which I encourage everybody to read, and that a book that is going to be coming out soon, I think, by Brookings. But beyond the 100 billion, how to use the 100 billion better? There is first part, and this is basically science. We have no metric to measure because there are a couple of questions about 100 billion. I would say it respectively, of course, to the south and the north, but anything and everything that's being thrown from the north to the south is being counted as part of the 100 billion. And even with that, we are not reaching the 100 billion. Such that needs really to be challenged, and I think it will be challenged at the COP. Role of the private sector, yes, the promise from Glasgow, financial institutions backed by $130 trillion of assets. There is a promise on that, but they need pipeline of projects. And that was one initiative that is going to be presented at the COP, that we worked hard with the UN system to build a pipeline of illustrative examples and projects in mitigation and adaptation, and they are going all to be shared. That if you are serious, we can really get the pipeline of projects that you are asking for. They are coming from the 5 regional economic commissions of the UN system, and they are balanced between adaptation and mitigation, and lots of PPP projects on infrastructure. On debt, it was mentioned, I think the issue on debt here, we are too much relying on debt instruments. More than 62% of climate finance is coming from debt globally. In the case of developing economies, the share of debt is even higher. So anything that we need to do, whether FDI, private equity participation can help, that would be great, but we need better business environment for the developing economies and pipeline, in addition to a list of matters that Dr. Ahluwalia mentioned as well. When it comes to the role of the MDBs in de-risking, it is very fair assumption to say private sector flows will not really reach developing economies without adequate support from governments through their domestic resource mobilization, less crowding out, but definitely more support from the MDBs, including in de-risking and insurance against political risk. Swaps, there was a question about that. Yes, swaps could help. There are 3 examples from Seychelles, from Belize, and more recently from Barbados. I like more the one from Barbados. Not, of course, they have this formidable, outspoken, charismatic Prime Minister, Maya Motley, but not just because of that, but because it is KPI related. That gives us more opportunities for scale rather than them being project based. They are KPI based, so you can link them in a good day to the NDCs, and then we can start to see some sort of decent transformation in scale and size. There is an interesting IMF staff paper. So this means only staff at this level that has a good survey of different modalities of swaps. And there is some good coverage of the KPI based ones. On carbon markets, I like to alert the audience that there is some serious work led by Dr. Mohammed Farid, the head of the Financial Regulatory Authority. Dr. Ashraf should know that soon, because I don't think it came yet at the board, but it's being under consideration to have a pan-African carbon market capturing main ideas from the European market. You are very much right about what you said, that Europe is much more advanced than the US. China borrowed ideas from Europe and they developed their own. I think we're doing the same, but with some sort of collaboration with other African countries, including Gabon, which has a very good example with a very able and competent minister leading the work there, Minister Lee White, who's trying to link not just climate, but nature as well, and a bit of biodiversity added with the good use of the forest there as well. On blended finance, the minister just mentioned that, so I'll not elaborate on it. But definitely, in whatever we blend, we need to keep hot money away from the whole thing. To the question that came from the audience, FDI is welcome. Long-term finance on construction term, definitely welcome. But hot money, at best, you can consider it like salt and pepper and other flavors. But you are not going just to eat salt. So it's basically you need to keep that hot money to remind you of some interesting arbitrage, some interesting utilization of differences in market conditions. But to live on hot money, well, unless you can live in salt, that'll be another one. Actually, some people tried, but this is another discussion. Dr. Hassan. Yes, this is another discussion, I said. All right. And the final thing, being at the Ministry of Planning next door and the Institute of Planning here, and the minister mentioned something that could be of relevance to perhaps to your reaction, Dr. Ahluwalia, that when we did this work and you emphasized the role of DRM or domestic resource mobilization, there is the issue here of integrated national financial framework. And Dr. Khalid worked with us on this report about public spending, and we reach limits. Whatever we do in the fiscal space, you cannot really have the best acrobatic behavior will not really help us more than what we can. We need to have opportunities to expand the fiscal space, better tax collection and domestic resource mobilization, more prioritization. But I think if you add the climate action and climate finance to the development finance as part of development finance, and this gets back us to that discussions with Alligate and Duflo, that there is no contradiction. It's the synergy between climate action and development. Some institutions like the World Bank are comfortable swimming in the two waters of climate and development because this is what they do. Some other organizations are only focusing on one but divorcing the other. So it's basically about the articulation of public policy and institutions to make sure that climate action and climate finance is answering some big questions. We have the Honorable Minister, former Minister of Electricity. This is part of climate action, what he did, and part of SDG 7, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it has an impact on poverty alleviation, has an impact on community development. So this issue, while I believe in the importance of specialization, but we went into silos and people were not even talking to each other the climate camp and the development camp, sometimes they are called. And I think the paper that next term, and I think you were involved in this one as well, and Vera and the rest of colleagues is trying to solve this issue. But we don't have the luxury in these games anymore. Mobilize resources, have adequate funding to the matter. This gets me into a very final note, because you mentioned something and you shared it with me before the meeting. Egypt is invited kindly by India next year to be a member or an observer of the G20. And it's going to be a very important year for us because, as I said, we're starting our role as president of the COP. And having Egypt there with ideas coming from the COP to follow it up, especially in the implementation, will be great. One idea definitely is what you said about the NDB sitting on the board of, as well of one of the financial institutions. I know that G7, G20 have a very important role there, especially with the capital increase, with the revisions of the quota-based revisions. So that could be a good opportunity to emphasize that. But the other thing, when it comes to the replenishment of IDA and the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund and the likes, I have an idea that climate finance for low middle-income countries, not just low-income countries, should be extended based on IDA terms. This is long-term, grace period of around 7 to 10 years. The cost is not really that big, 1.5% on average, and you pay back in 30 to 40 years. Extending IDA terms to cover low middle income countries could be a good start. And I like IDA because it's more democratic as well, because it gets the beneficiaries with the contributors at the same table and has a good monitoring mechanism. It's more efficient than the alternative. And that could be one idea to explore, not just within the World Bank. It's basically IDA term to be extended to other financial institutions. Having said that, it's a process that is starting with this kind of knowledge sharing. And I hope that this could be followed up and there will be opportunities to discuss that further in a few days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. And I believe Dr. Mahmoud has answered many of the questions that I have received from the floor. Before ending with the fruitful closing remarks from Dr. Ahluwalia, I will ask Dr. Khalid for just 1 minute, 2 minutes. To give one is enough. Okay. Thank you.
I think we have. I'm very happy for these discussions. I mean, and all the inputs and all the questions. Just one thing for the question coming from the lady from the Ministry of Finance. When you're looking into carbon market, definitely looking into green taxes. Don't look at it as a tax, yeah, okay? Because we know that you are very keen to get more taxes. But if these taxes does not flow back, if it's not earmarked for climate change, then we better not address it. Because that mean. Another thing is that the green bonds and relying on the green bonds, the problem is with the green bonds, as you all know, that it requires a heavy system for follow-up so that you can be transparent to the people that has contributed. So it requires a system. And I think the system is not yet completely in place. We need to develop this further. Thank you very much. And I hope
Thank you very much. It's less than 1 minute. Thank you very much. And we are keen to and wait for the fruitful remarks, closing remarks from Dr. Ahluwalia.
So give me an idea of how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. That's very
We
good.
can extend it. Thank you.
I think Mahmoud has already answered many of the questions. So let me just use these 5 minutes to make a few points. One, somebody asked, can FDI fill the gap? I mean, the short answer is not the whole gap, but I have no doubt whatsoever that FDI can play a very important role in a large number of areas, particularly in the whole business of creating green power generation capacity. You may need to leverage it a little. You may need to support it a little. Oh, okay. So I think the short answer is yes, FDI can play a role. What is the role of philanthropy? You know, it's wonderful that there are people willing to dish out their own money, and we should really admire them for it. But let's face it, it's a very small part of what is needed. But, we don't have the money, so I think we should welcome it. The big advantage of the philanthropy is that they managed to get a lot of very, very motivated young people to monitor these projects and find the kind of interesting projects and, do unusual things, which ministries won't do. So I would be very happy if somebody had a way of doubling or trebling the philanthropy, but don't have any expectation that the quantity of that is anything like the scale of what we're talking about. So that's so much for that. Is it a good idea for 5% of the budget to go for climate change? I think it's not a good idea. And the reason is precisely what Mahmoud clarified. We have to get away from this distinction between this is climate finance, this is development finance. I mean, the fact is development finance has to be sustainable, and sustainable has to include whatever the climate considerations are. So I think 100% of the budget should be for sustainable development finance, not separating them out. I made one notion that should the central bank push private banks to go for green money? I don't think so. Now, this is a typical, I've been in the finance ministry before, so I'm probably reflecting those prejudices. More damage is done by mucking around with the banking system than any conceivable good. And we, in any case, do some of that by saying the banks must give, I'm in favor of that, certain amount of loans must go to, let's say, small farmers. But once you start saying green finance, some of the biggest corporations in the country will be putting up projects and saying this is green finance and preempting bank money for that. And I don't think it's a good idea. Developed countries must stop growth. No. Frankly, the developed countries should, as it were, put their money where their mouth is and introduce a carbon tax. If they were to introduce a sensible carbon tax, I would encourage them to grow because it will help our exports, it will help world trade. But telling the developing countries to stop growing is really not the solution. So I would urge you to intervene on my behalf on that one. Then a couple of points on carbon markets. I'm not a great admirer of carbon markets. And the reason is the carbon market concept is a sneaky way of trying to bring in what is actually a carbon tax, but it makes it completely non-transparent. And what is a carbon market? It's going and telling someone, you can only emit so much, you can only emit so much, et cetera, et cetera. And if you manage to emit less than what you're permitted, then that's a carbon credit, which you can sell in the market to somebody who's emitting more. But you get a much cleaner result by simply imposing a carbon tax. I think the question that was just raised, that what do you do with those resources, that's relevant. If you want to earmark them for certain things, that's fine. But if the development budget is actually sustainable, then just earmark it for development budget, not for this or that project. That's my view. Green bonds. I think this is overdone. I don't have any objections to green bonds, but as he said, in the end, green bonds will only survive as a system if there's enough ability to certify that these bonds resources are really going into green projects. And I can assure you there'll be hundreds of civil society organizations watching carefully whether this is greenwashing or genuine greening. So frankly, I don't expect it to get anywhere. But even if it did, what would it do to developing countries? What is our problem? Our problem is that as countries, the macroeconomic risk and the country risk and the foreign exchange risk leads to a very high interest rate. That is not going to disappear by green bonds. All that a green bond will do is it will enable a developing country issuer to compete with somebody in a developed country for the green bond market. But if the green bond market in a developed country has a project risk, which is X, and the green bond market, the green bond in the developing country has a project which has a risk of 2x, then the only difference will be that marginal premium. You don't get rid of the higher cost, which is the result of country and project risk and foreign exchange risk. And those are the things that make raising money very difficult. So I don't believe that the green bonds will make much of a difference. I know in India, many of the large corporates are quite like to get into the corporate market because it's fashionable. I mean, when you meet your buddies in Davos and they say, how many green bonds did you raise? Oh, 50 million. Oh, that's pretty good. You know, it's part of being fashionable, but it's not going to do very much for the financing. So I wouldn't count on that too much. So I think, yes, the biggest question, most difficult, as citizens, what can we do? Well, you know, I think number one, please get more informed. Number two, please tell your politicians to come clean. How are they going to translate the slogans that they mouth, which we also applaud, into actual action? And number four, be ready to get some tough decisions. I mean, there's no free lunch. So, I mean, if a citizen says, I care, that citizen, I mean, I respect the citizen who says, let's go for a carbon market, and somebody else says, no, let's have taxation. But not somebody who neither in favor of carbon markets nor taxation, but wants green development. So I think too much of what a citizen should do is really learn to distinguish between what slogans are supported by sensible policies. And if these policies are hard and tough, to understand that there are some benefits which will come. So that's really what citizens should do. And by the way, if they were to do that, this is going to take a long time because 2050 and 2070 are a long way away. But, you know, if in 2-3 years we can change perceptions, and I'm most hopeful of changing perceptions of young people. I'm really surprised that 10-year-olds are willing to take on all kinds of things in the belief that is good for society, which the 50-year-olds and more are also willing to endorse, but they never actually act on it. So this is what the citizens should get, younger people, because frankly, it's their future that's at stake. I don't know if that helps, but anyway, thank you all for listening to me. Maybe I spoke for too long. But
thank you very much, Dr. Montek. And we are very pleased and we are happy that you have accepted the invitation because we have profit and benefit very much from your points, actually. And thank you, Dr. Khalid Fahmy, being with us on the panel. And of course, champion of climate change. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, for the initiative of these distinguished lectures. We are learning each time from the panelists and from the audience. Thank you very much for the audience that they have stayed with us for 2 hours, maybe 2 hours and a half. Thank you very much. And see you after the COP, because we are going... Yes, of course. And all the people, the virtually audience, thank you very much being with us for 2. Yes. And I want to remind you that we are going to continue these distinguished lectures after the COP till November 23. Dr. Mahmoud, you have mentioned that we are still raising awareness of the importance of climate change and beyond, of course, inshallah. Thank you very much. Can I ask the panelists to stay